Designing a PKI Part 2. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of designing a PKI, and so this is part 2, where we start off by discussing external versus internal CAs. In other words, do we want to use third-party CAs, like Thought or VeriSign, or internal CAs that you develop within your own company? Also, we take a look here at standalone CAs, which is just one type of an internal CA, or enterprise CAs, which is another type of internal CA. In most organizations, you'll use some combination of both of these. Also, we'll take a look at template versions. These are the basis upon which any new certificates are created, and we'll take a look at the 3 versions that are available, and then finally we'll take a look at an overall view of kind of a sample PKI hierarchy that's a really good starting point for most organizations. Well, this weekend, I was a dutiful parent, and I went to my daughter's high school state cheerleading championships. And I don't know if you go to these kinds of things, but I got to tell you, they're really big events, and they usually take place in professional sports arenas. So this is a big event, and it was very, very loud while we were in there. Well, while I'm in there at the competition, and of course there's all kinds of cheering and noise going on, my son called me, and he was still at home, but I couldn't hear him. So I walked out to the concourse area, and I realized I had to use the men's room anyway, so I started heading towards the men's room. And as I walked into the bathroom, I paused for a moment and suddenly realized, yes, I was in the ladies' room. I was surrounded by all kinds of high school cheerleaders. And, of course, it was purely accidental. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Other than that, my attorney has advised me not to say anything else about the matter. But he thinks he can get me off. Anyway, it kind of would be nice if we could actually verify things. Now, I just didn't verify the sign by the ladies' room. I should have verified that so that I could realize I was going into the wrong place. And we can verify things, of course, with certificates. We can do things such as, of course, to confirm things using a signature, and that's very, very useful. But all of this kind of stuff has to have a starting point. You don't just set up a CA and get it to start working. You have to have a strategy in advance, which is what we talked about in our last nugget, and then you also have to know what kinds of certificate authorities you want. And the first thing that you probably have to think about there is whether or not you want an internal CA or an external CA. And of course, there are advantages or disadvantages to each of those that we need to think about. First of all, the external CAs are those kinds of companies that I'm sure you've heard about, Thought and VeriSign and Microsoft and certain other companies there. Well, these companies like Thought and VeriSign, they're very stringent in identifying who it is that's requesting certificates from them. So that you, in the highest level at least, you have to often go to a trusted party such as a bank manager. You have to get documentation confirming that some other trusted person has confirmed your identity and all kinds of things like this. So it's a pretty big vetting process. Because of the stringent requirements that they have for confirming someone's identity and validity, these third-party companies become commonly trusted. And as a result, they're usually installed by default in the Trusted Root CA. Now here I've just opened up a empty console and I've added in the certificates item here, snap-in, for the current user account. And the only reason for showing you this is so you can see that, yeah, indeed, a lot of these are already here. Trusted Root Certification Authorities. Well, there's Microsoft in here. There they are. There's Microsoft. There's Authentic Code. There's Thought. And there's all different kinds of ones in there. And then you'll also see some for the intermediate certification authorities as well. There's certificates here for VeriSign and so forth. So you get the idea. Because of the fact that they're commonly trusted, if I get a certificate that is issued to me by VeriSign, then if I sign an email and send that email to somebody else, well, chances are they've already also got this default item in their intermediate certification authorities as well. Therefore, they're going to be able to trust my certificate as a valid certificate. So again, they're commonly trusted and placed in the root CA or intermediate CA as well. Then there's also going to be normally less administration. You still have to come up with your planning, you still have to determine what your needs are, but that's kind of whiteboard stuff, the stuff that you do at the early phases of this. Once you get the certificates, not a whole awful lot you do except for make sure that you renew the ones you need to before they expire. But there's also potentially more expense. You have to pay for each one of those certificates, and even though it might only be a few dollars, if you have 70,000 employees in your company, that's a big budget item that you're probably going to have to go through, all different kinds of approval all different kinds of approval processes to be able to get passed. And of course, moreover, besides just that initial expense in getting the certificates, if they're for your users and your computers, well, very often those certificates are only good for a year or 2 years. So then you have to do the whole thing all over again in another year and put all the money out there once more. Now, this is also a little bit of a sliding scale when you compare an external CA to an internal CA, because we generally consider that these are less expensive. But let's take a look at something here. I'm just going to kind of put together a chart here real quick. Let's just say that this represents the dollar amount that you're spending, and this represents the number of certificates that you need to have. If I have a low number of certificates, let's say I have 12 certificates that I need, well, it's going to possibly make sense to go to an external CA in some ways, because I only have to pay a few dollars each. Therefore, my expense is really not very high, just right up there, whatever that is, okay, a couple $100 maybe. All right, however, as my number of users grows, maybe I've got 12,000 users instead, then of course my expense goes up dramatically as well. So now it is more expensive. It depends on how many users or how many certificates you need for your organization. Now, on the other hand, this can change here as well. So let me, by the way, put it in here like this. We start off with 12 users, and if we grow up to 12,000 users, then of course we get to this level of expense, which is very high. On the other hand, I'm going to kind of go out of order just briefly here. With my internal CAs, we generally consider those to be less expensive. So what I do there is I start with a high level of expense for my internal CAs. Let me change my pen color to make that a little bit more clear. I start with a high expense for my internal CA, and I've invested in all my servers. I've invested in Windows Server 2008 Enterprise or Data Center Edition, probably more than several copies of those. And so I'm in the at least tens of thousands of dollars before I've even issued my first certificate to my first user. Okay, so that initially seems very knee-jerk expensive right there. However, that would be extremely expensive and unjustified if I only had 12 users. But as I go up to 12,000 users, or more, let's say 20,000 users, then if I were to do this on an individual certificate basis, that would get way out there. But here I've got a kind of a fixed cost now, and it's fairly level. There's maintenance expenses and things like that, and paying for IT staff to maintain and manage it. But overall, I've kind of fixed my ceiling a little bit for the expense of these certificates. Whereas with external CAs, it keeps going up and up and up, and then you have to renew them next year, and then they go up and up and up. So something to think about there. Also, another thing to think about here, as I change back to a different color here, is that you will generally have less liability with an external CA. And why would that be? Well, if the external CA's certificates get compromised somehow, they were never really your responsibility to begin with. So if you have a partner that was depending upon your certificates to authenticate signatures or to correctly encrypt or decrypt something, and it got compromised and someone else was able to exploit something, well, that was never your certificate in the first place. You really never generated that yourself. Somebody else did. So you don't have the same burden of liability, although you'll probably still get sued. Less liability doesn't mean less legal expense. It just means less real liability. Okay, that's the way the world is, isn't it? Okay, then over here on the internal CAs, we have things that are a little bit different. Because over here, we'll have our own company, PKI, or Public Key Infrastructure. Over here, we're not concerned with PKI. I mean, our third party has a PKI of some kind, but I don't really care what their structure looks like. I just want certificates. That's it. Here, we have to develop the whole thing ourselves and decide what it's going to look like and strategize that appropriately. Then, we have to decide, we have to realize also that our certificates are not going to be trusted in the public. Now, within our own corporation, if that's the only place we ever intend to use our certificates, we're fine. Because the certificates are going to be trusted within our own corporation, especially if we're going to use enterprise CAs, and we'll talk about those shortly here. Also, if they're not trusted, then if I want to force them to be trusted, I have to manually install the root CA and the intermediate CA's certificates into all of my client computers. Okay, so that's just something else to think about there. Although they can also be automatically installed through things such as policy, or if we're using enterprise internal CAs, then that will happen automatically. Also, there's going to be generally more administration for an internal CA and more responsibility on your IT staff. I mean, we have to configure the servers, install operating systems, come up with our strategy for CAs. We are responsible for issuing them. So there's going to be a little bit more burden there on us. There's also going to be somewhat less expense, but again, remember, this is kind of a sliding scale. It just depends on where you are and how many certificates you need to be issued, but kind of the default Microsoft answer is less expense for internal, more expense for external. And then you also have more liability. I mean, if you made a mistake or somebody was careless about how they configured your certificates, or they didn't use a strong enough encryption level, or you had a government contract that required you that you use 2048-bit hash, and you only used 1024, oops, well now you're in violation of the contract. So you see there's all different kinds of things to think about there, and you really have to be careful about those sorts of things. So that's an external CA, again, from a third party. This is an internal CA, and for the most part, the Microsoft exam and our own purposes is going to revolve around the internal CA. The only time I think you might see reference to external CAs is when the big issue comes up where you want your certificates to be commonly trusted and virtually transparent in their use, so that users don't, on another company or outside of your organization, don't have to manually install some kind of a root CA certificate or intermediate CA certificate, or go through any kinds of hoops to trust it. That's the only time you'll probably see a reference to that. Otherwise, we're pretty much over here on the right-hand side. Now, once you decide that you need to use an internal CA, you have two basic types to choose from: a standalone CA or an enterprise CA. And I'm going to just quickly change pen color here just because I don't want it to clash with the right side over here, so I'll just go with, for some reason I went with hot pink. I don't know why. Probably best if I don't think about it too much. But anyway, we're going to use a different color here. So anyway, we're going to use a standalone CA which has no relationship to Active Directory whatsoever. Now, the certificate authority server itself, it could be a domain member. But when you install the wizard and you decide to select a standalone CA, you have the two options. You could choose Enterprise CA or Standalone CA if the certificate authority server is a member of the domain. Now, this is not usually very smart, or doesn't usually happen very often. Most of the time, a standalone CA will be a workgroup member. Okay? So anyway, again, no Active Directory relationship. And because of that, there's no way to confirm the identity of people that request certificates. This could potentially set you up, by the way, for a huge denial of service attack, because somebody could set up a script, if they get on your network, and barrage you with certificate requests. So that's another reason why a standalone CA is normally not even going to be left on. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But standalone CAs are usually up for a few minutes. You get the certificates you need out of them, and then you usually shut them off. Now, the request, again, since there's no way to confirm their identity in Active Directory, the request will be manually processed. You can do it from a command line, you can do it from an MMC console, or if you've set up the CA this way, you can set it up to accept requests from a web page. Then you can also supply information manually, such as the kind of hash that you want to use, or the length of the hash you want to use, 2048, whatever it is. And then once you request that certificate, you don't automatically get it. In other words, there's no auto-enrollment on a standalone CA. It's a pending request, and an administrator at that CA has to go to the pending requests node, pending certificates node, and then they have to approve or deny each certificate. Then we have something called certificate templates. These are templates that we can custom configure for our own extensions and our own purposes. However, on a standalone CA, you do not have that ability. You have to take whatever's in the box, and that's what you get. And that's usually okay for a standalone CA, because we don't really get very fancy with these. Everything that's in the box normally should already meet your needs. Then there's you have to manually install a standalone CA in the user's trusted root, because you're trying to issue certificates from a standalone CA that's not going to be already listed in this this console item that I showed you earlier. It's not already listed there. It's nuggetlab.com certificate authority. Well, of course, Microsoft doesn't know anything about that, so they didn't put it in here. So we would have to find a way to get those manually installed in each user's trusted root. Then the other thing to think about there is that you can set up a standalone CA in most roles as a root CA, and we'll look at that shortly here, but just bear that in mind for now. It's normally going to be installed in the root CA role and a subordinate CA role. Now, for the enterprise CA side of things, a lot of this gets significantly easier and more automated. Now, for this one, the Active Directory is required. And by the way, notice that I've switched to a nice manly green color here. But Active Directory is actually required for an enterprise CA. Because of that, when your users enroll for a certificate, you can configure it so that they are automatically enrolled, because we can automatically identify the identity of that user or computer. It works for both. And then that makes auto-enrollment possible. Also, with an enterprise CA, you have to have an enterprise CA if you want to use smart cards or any kind of token-based authentication. They both really do the same thing. Smart cards, of course, are those credit card-sized devices with contacts on them so that they slip into a smart card reader and can read the certificates and keys off of that smart card. A token is very often the same kind of thing. It also has a certificate on it, but that can be put on a USB type of a device, or it can also be associated with various types of biometric devices. But anyway, the certificates can be stored there using enterprise CAs. All right. Then there's also certificates, and revoked certificates are going to be published to Active Directory. This is very handy, because if I have a user whose smart card gets lost or gets mangled or something happens to it, then what happens here is I've already got another copy of their same exact certificate in Active Directory, and it makes it possible for me to recover that certificate and put it on a new smart card. Although for lost smart cards, it's usually best if you just generate a new certificate with new keys. But the point here really is that all that stuff is now published in Active Directory. Then it's also going to involve revoked certificates. Certificate revocation is a big deal with the certificate authorities, because I want to make sure that any certificates that have not been expired but that should no longer be trusted, for example with employees that quit or got fired or something like that, well, we don't want to trust their certificates anymore. So chances are when that user leaves the company, we want to revoke that user's certificate. It then gets put into a list called the certificate revocation list. Now when other users check against that certificate, maybe they got a signed email from that person or something like that, well, they need to check that certificate, and if it checks against the certificate revocation list and says that that certificate has been revoked, then we know we should not trust it anymore. Okay, we'll talk more about revocation and things as well as we go. Also, with an enterprise CA, you have Type 2 and Type 3 templates. Over here, remember I said something about no certificate templates? Actually, you do have one. They're called version 1 templates, but you can't modify them for your own purposes. Those are the out-of-the-box templates. Here we still have version 1 templates, or Type 1 templates, but we also have Type 2 and Type 3 templates. These were available in Windows Server 2003, and they allowed us to custom modify our certificates to whatever purpose that we want. Version 3 templates are the same thing as version 2 templates, or I keep saying version, but they're also Type 2 templates, but they add additional levels of security to Type 3 templates, but alas, they can only be read by Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista. So if you've got XP or other down-level clients, you got to stick with version 2, or Type 2. Also, any enrollment requests that I have, like I said, can be automatically filled in. So when auto-enrollment takes place, for example, we don't have to specify the length of the hash or which hash we've decided to use and all of that. If we set all that up on the administrative side at the get-go, then the users and the computers automatically get their certificates without having to fill in any information. So just real quickly here, as a brief detour, let me summarize that again with templates. There are 3 versions. Version 1, which is also included with Windows 2000, and any current standalone CA, is the only certificate template type that you can use. These are uncustomizable or static. And then you have version 2 templates. These are customized duplicates. You can right-click on an existing template and choose Duplicate Template. Then that duplicate, or that copy, is custom modifiable so that you can change its purposes, change what it's used for, change the bit length for the hash, all those sorts of things. And that's pretty handy. That was available first with Windows 2003. Then with Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista, we have version 3 templates. These are also customized duplicates, just like I mentioned before. Plus, you have cryptography next generation capabilities with it, which gives you extremely high levels of security with those certificates. It's almost like science fiction. It's very, very high levels of security. But again, only by Vista and 2008. They're the only ones that can read that. So if you have down-level clients, you'll have to stick with the version 2. So let's bring all this together and take a look at a diagram that kind of helps give us a little bit more perspective. Now, this is kind of a serving suggestion, what we see here. This is not necessarily what you'll wind up with, but it's a good starting point, and it can vary depending upon your needs and the size of your organization. For example, a really small organization might only have a single CA and there's no hierarchy involved at all. A little bit larger organization might have just the top level and the bottom levels. You might be able to eliminate this middle level and save yourself some expense there as well. But in most cases, especially larger medium organizations or bigger organizations, you're going to have at least a 3-tier architecture, much like what we see here. Now, the root CA is a standalone CA, as I mentioned earlier. I do strongly recommend that you make any standalone CAs not members of Active Directory. And the reason for that is because these are normally going to be taken offline, which means permanently shut off after they've issued the certificates that they need to. And if they're a member of Active Directory and you turn them off, and this might have, a 20-year certificate. If you turn this back on, even a year from now, the computer password for this computer will be expired in the domain, and you would have to disjoin it and rejoin it, which is just a hassle and it's unnecessary. And root CA doesn't need to be a member of a domain. So make it a work group membership. Okay, same with these down here. The other thing to think about here is that, like I said earlier, these are normally going to be made offline. So once I've issued my certificates to my intermediate CAs, which then in turn allows them to become CAs and issue certificates to other CAs down here, well, then I can pretty much turn it off. For that reason, I normally will make these VMware machines or virtual PC machines. And what I'll often do is I'll put those entire virtual machines, all their files and folders, on a double-layered DVD, because a single one is often not big enough, a double-layered DVD or some other removable media like an external USB drive, and I'll put a copy of the current version of VMware or virtual PC or virtual server, whatever you're using, on that DVD as well, or that removable media. Then I'll lock all of that in a safe. And that way my root CA is offline, cannot be attacked on a network, and so forth. All right? Now, the other thing I'll do here then, once this has been configured, its only purpose in life in this hierarchy is to issue 2 certificates. Once it's issued those, it's pretty much done for 20 years, or 19 until I have to renew the certificate. Then, when this intermediate CA here has a certificate, and I've installed it as an intermediate CA, it can then issue certificates to other certificate authorities. Now, these are often called policy CAs. And the reason why is because they are kind of segmented according to policy. For example, this one's primarily used for user certificates. This one's for computer certificates. That's one way to break that up into a couple of different kinds of purposes. But these policy or intermediate CAs are also standalone CAs, and once they've issued their certificates to this bottom tier or the third tier of my PKI hierarchy, then these can also be turned offline. And in fact, the way this often looks is I'm going to try to draw a straight line all the way across here, and let's see if I'm successful in being able to do that. Hold on just a moment. People say that if you can draw a straight line, that's a good measure of your level of sanity. So let's see if I can do it. Yeah, that's a straight line. It's not level, but it is straight. Okay, I cheated. I used the binding of a book to be able to do that. But anyway, these up here are always offline. Okay? These down here are online. And why is that? Well, once these have issued their certificates, they're not needed anymore. And these certificate authorities here, they're probably issuing certificates very frequently. Like my email and EFS certificates, I get new employees, I need to issue the certificates for those folks. So this needs to be constantly available, and in fact, you might even use something else like network load balancing to be able to make sure that you have multiple of these certificate authorities available, and also depending on how dispersed your organization is geographically. But these are always going to be offline. These, at least if you follow the book, so to speak, these are always going to be offline certificate authorities. Now, one question that's not really answered in this is, why do we have these 3 tiers? Why not just install this bottom layer and save ourselves the trouble and the expense of all this stuff up here? The reason for that is because we want to limit the damage that could happen, among other things, if there was a compromise with a certificate authority. For example, these are offline so they can never be attacked. But Let's say that my email and EFS certificate server, it got compromised somehow. Somebody figured out the administrator password. They may have issued certificates that are not trusted. We don't know what's going on with it. So we figure the best thing to do is to down the whole thing and reissue a new email and EFS server, certificate authority, and reissue all of our certificates. Well, if this was the only server that was compromised, these are good. This one's good, this one's good, this one's good. And then all of these up here are still good because they weren't on the network in the first place. They've been turned off, for years. So by giving myself a hierarchy like this, I significantly limit the scope of damage. Whereas, if I had a single CA that did everything that we see here, if it got compromised, I would lose not only these certificates, but these and these and these. All the certificates that it was issuing, if it was only one CA in my whole organization, puts me in a lot of trouble with my certificates. Now, likewise, it's almost impossible, like I said, to attack these offline servers, but let's just say something happened. This was turned on just momentarily to renew a certificate from its root CA, and while that happened, some hacker coincidentally figured a way through my firewall and compromised it. Bam. Well, yeah, now I've lost this CA. And as a result of that, since it can't be trusted anymore, neither can these two down here in a hierarchical sense. So this one has to be brought down, this one has to be brought down. We again have to build new servers down here, or new CAs at least, and start all over again. And we'd also have to, of course, build a new one up here. But what have I done once again? Even though this was a fairly high-level compromise, I didn't touch my computer certificates. These are still safe, and therefore these certificate authorities here are still safe in addition to any certificates that they have issued. So that's a big reason for the PKI hierarchy, is so that you can control the scope of damage in case of an emergency. And also, as a clarification, I've mentioned a few times that these, of course, are offline, but they might not be offline for 20 years or whatever. They will periodically have to be brought back online to, number one, either receive new certificates or issue new certificates to these down here. If this is 20 years, these are 10, these are probably 5 years. Well, after a while, 4.5 years or something, I'm going to have to reissue or request a new certificate from this CA. So it'll have to be brought on for that purpose. Also, all of these CAs will have a certificate revocation list publication, and we'll have to bring them on periodically so that they can publish to their CRIL. Also, I haven't mentioned operating systems here in this nugget. I think I did in the previous one. But just as a review, these top levels here, these can all be Windows Server 2008 Standard Edition, whatever the cheapest version is. It's standard, because we don't need Data Center, Enterprise, anything like that. An issuing CA that wants to be an Enterprise CA, that's going to have to be an Enterprise or Data Center edition, Enterprise being the cheaper of the two. And the reason for that is because normally for a lot of these roles down here at this bottom level, you'll probably want auto-enrollment. Well, that requires that they are Enterprise CAs. In order to be Enterprise CAs that also have custom configurable templates, you're going to have to make them either, again, Data Center or Enterprise. Alright, so what did we learn in this particular nugget? I'll tell you one thing I learned was that cheerleaders can hit a lot harder than you think. But what did we learn about a PKI in this part too? One thing we looked at was external versus internal CAs. Remember, there's budget constraints and considerations in each of these depending on how many certificates you need to issue. And there's also a difference between the administration, with external CAs requiring very little administration, internal CAs requiring a lot more. Also, we took a look at standalone versus Enterprise CAs. Oops, forgot to cross my A there. And remember, the standalone ones are not Active Directory integrated, and as such, they cannot do things such as auto-enrollment, whereas Enterprise CAs will support auto-enrollment because they can confirm the identity of the requesting party through Active Directory. We also took a look at 3 of the various template versions, with version 3 being the new certificate template type that you can use in Windows Server 2008. We also took a look at the PKI hierarchy, or kind of a serving suggestion of that, which is a great starting point for your understanding of what you should do for designing your PKI. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.